Schachter. This series of virtual events brings together the arts and sciences community to celebrate the power of the liberal arts to transform thinking, spread new ideas, and positively impact our communities. I will be serving as our moderator. My name is Tammy English. I received my PhD in psychology from UC Berkeley. And then I went across the bay to do my postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University. I'm now the associate professor in psychological and brain sciences, where I direct the emotion and relationships lab. I'm also an associate director of Triads, the Transdisciplinary Institute in Applied Data Sciences, which focuses on leveraging big data to address pressing social dilemmas, very relevant to the work we'll be talking about today. My research focuses on social, cognitive, and environmental factors that impact emotional well-being across adulthood into old age. So in a moment, I'll introduce Professor Ariela Schachter. She'll give a brief overview of some of her research, and then I'll read from some of the questions that were submitted by the audience ahead of time. We'll then take a few questions from the audience, so feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. You can do that anytime throughout the presentation or during the conversation. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Schachter. Ariela Schachter received her PhD in sociology from Stanford University, so something we have in common, in 2016. At WashU, she's an associate professor in sociology, an associate director of the Wiedenbaum Center, and a faculty affiliate in Asian American Studies. Her research focuses on immigration, race relations, and inequality in the United States, and has been published in leading sociological journals, including the American Sociological Review, Social Forces, and Social Problems. Professor Schachter's work employs a variety of research methods, including experiments, causal inference methods, big data, and computational text analysis, all things we're excited about with Triads too. She emphasizes that combining quantitative and qualitative data gives sociologists the richest possible understanding of the social world, which is absolutely fantastic. Some of you may have read about her research in the Ampersand, the Arts and Sciences magazine. In addition to her work in online rental markets, which we'll be discussing today, Professor Schachter has studied public attitudes towards immigrants, racial classifications in America. She's won multiple awards, including the Lewis Worth Best Article Award from the International Migration section of the American Sociological Association. So please join me in welcoming Professor Schachter.
Thank you so much, Tammy, for that generous introduction. And thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm really excited to get to share a little bit of my research with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I just have a few minutes of slides that I wanted to show to give you a bit of background on this project, but I'm not going to spend too long here because I'm really looking forward to our discussion in the Q&A. Before I get any further, I want to make sure that I acknowledge my wonderful collaborative research team without whom this project wouldn't be possible. And this includes a former postdoc of mine, John Cook, who was here with me at WashU for a few years before he got his first job as a professor, one of my current graduate students, Garrett Pekarek, and this project has also benefited from several wonderful undergraduate students who all keep doing the annoying thing of graduating and leaving me. So I have to keep finding new students to collaborate with. But this is really a collaborative project that is not possible with all of the great community at WashU and outside of it. We are really motivated here to understand why residential segregation by race, ethnicity, and immigrant status is so persistent in the United States, right? So although we have had several decades of increasingly positive and welcoming racial attitudes, in addition to important legislation that has outlawed discrimination in the housing market, we continue to see that residential segregation persists. And St. Louis is unfortunately a really good example of that. So here on your screen, you're seeing a map that just shows the distribution by race and ethnicity of the population in the St. Louis metro. And you can see that in particular, white and Black people in St. Louis tend to live in really different spaces. So that's represented by the green and the blue dots in particular. And for all of you who've spent time in St. Louis over the years or who live here now, I think you probably have experienced how this segregation impacts life on the ground, right? In terms of who we do and don't see in different neighborhoods, in terms of the spaces that we do and don't go into in the city and in the broader metro, and also is a huge driver of the inequality that continues to be a major challenge for the area. And so this project is trying to understand how might the housing search process itself be contributing to this persistent segregation that we see in St. Louis, but also in cities really across the country. And when I say the housing search process, what I mean is really simply, how is it that people decide where to live? Right? So what are the kind of decision-making process that people go through? What kind of information do they have available to them? And how does that influence where people end up living? In particular, we're focusing on renters, and that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, 36% of all Americans are renters, and actually the majority of people in cities are renters, right? So renting is a really common experience, but it's relatively understudied within research on the housing market. Importantly, renters are disproportionately non-white and immigrants. In fact, a majority of people of color and immigrants are renters throughout the United States. And so again, understanding dynamics in the rental market in particular is really important when we're asking these questions about segregation and inequality. Renters also, compared to homeowners, move more often, so they have higher rates of residential mobility, which means that they're making these housing decisions more frequently. And so those decisions might have a particular influence on segregation patterns. And importantly, renters face both a more competitive market. So compared to home buyers in terms of demand and supply, in most cities, renters actually face a more competitive market. And it's a less institutionalized market. And what I mean by that is that in comparison to the market for home ownership, where usually real estate agents and financial institutions like banks and mortgage lenders are deeply involved in the home buying process, and these are institutions that are highly regulated. Renters do not tend to engage with these types of institutions, right? And so most renter agreements are between an individual renter and an individual landlord, and there's a lot less oversight. We have less data in terms of being able to track these types of transactions. And so there's potentially more room for discriminatory practices or other mechanisms that might be contributing to segregation to kind of work their way into the rental market. Interestingly, both in the market for rental housing and in the homeownership market, right, we see a growing reliance on the internet, right? So thinking about sites like Craigslist, Zillow, Facebook Marketplace. And I think this is really important because we have a large body of research across the social sciences that shows that in a variety of contexts, we make our decisions based on the information available to us at that moment. And we also have a lot of research that shows that renters start out knowing pretty little about most of the neighborhoods in their own city. So here we're not thinking about people who might be moving across the country, but even just those who are moving, say, within St. Louis. Most people don't tend to know about many neighborhoods beyond the one that they currently live in. And the neighborhoods that we do tend to know about are highly racialized. So what I mean by that is that researchers have shown that white people tend to mostly know about other neighborhoods that are predominantly white, whereas Black people tend to know about neighborhoods that are predominantly Black. And so this neighborhood information is both limited, and we have what are called like blind spots, right? We tend to not be aware of neighborhoods where our own racial group is not in the majority. And so one of the big questions that people have been asking is, could these online housing platforms like Craigslist, like Zillow, like Facebook, which are at least in their best light, are democratizing access to information, could they actually be expanding equitable access to information about different neighborhoods in our own communities, and thereby helping to reduce segregation, right? And so that's really what's motivating this project here, is this idea that newly available technology that increases access to information can help kind of fight some of these racial blind spots that have been found in the previous literature. And our question is that actually happening? What information is available to people, and how does that work? So for those of you who might not be as familiar with some of these rental websites, I just want to give you a brief glimpse, right? So let's say we were looking for an apartment in St. Louis, and so we went to Craigslist, which is the most commonly used site for rental housing across the United States, right? So you might enter a landing page like this, which shows you a map of the St. Louis region, and these different bubbles are representing the number of current listings in these different areas throughout the metro. You can click on a bubble and it will then show you, it'll start to zoom in and you can start to see a number of listings in these different areas. Here's an example of one ad that we found in St. Louis. So this is an ad for an apartment in the Central West End, which many of you might have fond memories of, or perhaps are familiar with today, right? A relatively upscale neighborhood near WashU's medical campus, near Forest Park, with great shopping and restaurants. There's a Whole Foods that you can walk to. And you can see in this ad that these amenities of the neighborhood are really being emphasized in addition to the amenities of the housing itself. So I know the text is a bit small, but it emphasizes things like the building being historic and wonderful, granite countertops, perfect for every foodie's dream, right? They advertise that they are close to St. Louis University and Washington University. And what I want to emphasize here is that the ad is not just telling us these are the characteristics of the housing. It has 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and it does or doesn't allow pets. It's also giving us a glimpse into what type of person might want to live here, right? Who is a foodie? Who is someone who likes granite countertops? Who is someone who wants to live near a university? Who would want to live in the hustle and bustle of the Central West End? And I want you to keep these characteristics in mind when I show you this second advertisement, which is also for an apartment in the St. Louis metro, although a very different neighborhood, right? And here what we see is a really different type of information being shared. And so this ad really focuses on what are the tenant qualifications that are required or that would disqualify you from renting, right? So for example, this ad says you have to have a photo ID, a birth certificate, social security card, proof of income, that you cannot have any open bankruptcies, you can't have any history of evictions, and no history of felonies. In addition to really emphasizing these tenant qualifications and disqualifications, this ad is not giving us very much information about the housing itself or about the surrounding neighborhood. And these are patterns that are associated, that we have found in our data, are really tied to location. So here I'm just going back to this map of segregation in St. Louis. The first ad that you saw for the Central West End, right, it's down here on your map, right above Forest Park, in a part of the city that is pretty close to that dividing line of segregation, that Delmar divide that you might have heard of, but that is in a predominantly white area. That second ad that emphasized tenant qualifications is in North County, in a predominantly Black area. And so what we're trying to understand in this big project is, are these patterns that I just showed you systematic, right? Is there variation in the amount, type, and content of information that's being provided in listings that systematically varies depending on a neighborhood's racial, ethnic, or immigrant composition, as well as its poverty status? And then second, and really importantly, do these information differences matter, right? So we want to understand if information differences across neighborhoods shape prospective renters' interest in living in particular units and their perceptions of the surrounding neighborhood. And ultimately, right, we're asking these 2 questions because we really want to understand, is this online rental housing market combating or contributing to segregation? So to do this, right, we had to get creative with our data because existing data on the rental market is limited and doesn't include actual advertisements themselves. So we're not able to understand what information is being shared. And so instead, we used web scraping techniques to allow us to collect data from Craigslist, from St. Louis, but also from the 50 largest rental markets across the United States. And we've been doing this since 2017. And so at this point, we have millions and millions of advertisements. We actually ended up deciding, we were getting ready to wrap up. And then with the pandemic, we decided it was important to continue to observe these dynamics to see if there might be changes. So that work is still ongoing. And we use tools that have been developed by computer scientists, statisticians, linguists, and social scientists to try to understand these patterns in advertisement content, right? So with these millions and millions of ads, it's not very efficient for us to go one at a time, hand by hand, to try to look for patterns. Instead, we're going to rely on computers to do a lot of that lifting for us. And then second, we conduct surveys that have experiments embedded in them to test for patterns in how people interpret and react to these information differences that we're finding. And what this allows us to do is to examine whether different kinds of information that we're finding presented in these advertisements have differential effects depending on one's own racial or ethnic identity, immigrant status, and socioeconomic status, right? So we want to understand, does everyone read these ads and interpret them the same and view neighborhoods as equally desirable or undesirable, or does different information attract or repel different people, right? Because I think all of that is really important for us coming to this bigger question of how these advertisements may or may not be contributing to segregation. And really briefly, I'll just give you a preview of some of the things we're finding, right? So first, those two ads that I showed you were not just a random pick. They in fact really do represent the findings we found across major cities in the United States, that available information significantly varies depending on the ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic makeup of a neighborhood. And second, in the experiments we've been running, we find that prospective renters interpret information that I would characterize as legal and ostensibly race neutral, as in fact implying information about the surrounding neighborhood's racial, ethnic, immigrant, and socioeconomic composition. And so, for example, people see references to things like felony convictions and associate that with the neighborhood being predominantly Black. They see references to Whole Foods and granite countertops and associate that with the neighborhood being predominantly white. And we then see them using these assumptions to make decisions about which neighborhood they would want to live in or want to avoid. Here are a couple more examples of language that we have found that people interpret as highly racialized. So references to Section 8, which is a housing voucher program that certain low-income residents qualify for to get a subsidy to use in the private market. And we found that references to Section 8 are interpreted by prospective renters as suggesting that the neighborhood is Black and predominantly poor. We also find that advertisements being posted in Spanish lead people to assume that the neighborhood is predominantly Latinx, immigrant, and poor. And in contrast, right, a mention of Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, and similar amenities imply that a neighborhood is white and rich. So there's a lot more data and a lot more findings to get into, and I'm excited to talk about in the Q&A, but really broadly, we think that our evidence is showing that these online housing platforms are likely contributing to continuing residential segregation rather than combating it as many have hoped. And also really importantly, that our fair housing laws, which are laws that were part of a broader civil rights legislation in the 1960s that outlawed explicit discrimination in the housing market, including the rental housing market, have potentially become outdated with these new advances in technology. As we're sharing information in different ways, our laws surrounding discrimination in the rental housing market have not kept up. And so I think we really need to reconsider whether and how technology can combat residential segregation, because it's not doing that right now. And I will end here so that we can get into the Q&A, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you, Professor Schachter, for sharing that really important and interesting work with us. And thank you to everybody who submitted questions in advance. Just a reminder that you can submit any questions you may have now or that may come to you during our discussion by just using the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. Okay, to get us started, can you just tell us a little bit more about how you got interested in doing this kind of work and how being located in St. Louis in particular, that's known for redlining and the Del Mar Divide that you mentioned, may have influenced your interest in this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started thinking about this project before I even got to WashU. So I think Tammy mentioned earlier, I did my PhD at Stanford, and you might know that housing prices in the Bay Area can be quite high, and PhD student stipends do not always keep up with rising rental prices. And so I found myself frequently moving and looking often at advertisements, and I started to notice hey, I'm not just figuring out which has the right number of bedrooms that I can afford, that's in a location that will be, convenient for my commute. But I'm also getting a sense of what type of person is this landlord seeming to want to attract, and who do I think lives in the neighborhood? And so that idea was in the back of my head when I got here to WashU back in 2016. Wow, I've been working on this project for a long time. But St. Louis in particular is a setting that really pushes us to think really hard about residential segregation, I think. And in fact, one of the projects that we've been working on with this data is specifically looking at St. Louis and thinking about where do neighborhoods like basically not even exist in the online market? And so what we're finding is that North City neighborhoods in particular sometimes don't have any posts at all. And if they do have posts, people are not using the neighborhood's name. They might just say St. Louis City when asked to describe the neighborhood. And really thinking about how neighborhood reputations are part of the way that housing is being advertised, and that the kind of the market value of a neighborhood, or the perceived market value of a neighborhood, can lead to some neighborhoods really being made invisible in the market. And what does that mean for people who live in them already? And what does that mean for who may or may not move into that neighborhood in the future?
Great, thank you. The next question that we have that was submitted in advance is asking about specifically thinking about this in terms of the online market. So it said there were inequalities long before the internet existed, of course, and even after discriminatory ads were outlawed. So how do you think the online market is different?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And again, our project is motivated because there was this idea out there, which I think actually we see in a lot of different domains, right? That we can harness technology to fight inequality, right? I think that's a common thread that we see in a lot of different domains, not just the housing market. But that is certainly one of the ideas behind, sites like Craigslist, Zillow, Facebook Marketplace, right, where it's free to use them. And so you don't have the gatekeepers that you did in the past in terms of even knowing if a home was for sale or rent in the first place. And that this kind of democratizing of sharing information that technology allows us to do in a way we never could before. There's good reasons to think that it might be able to fight some of these inequalities and discriminatory practices, right? If people know everything that's available to them, they're not going to necessarily be so susceptible to a real estate agent steering them into one particular neighborhood over another, for example. And yet we're not finding that to be the case, at least in the rental market where we're focused. And so I think, again, this is also something we're seeing across other domains, that advances in technology are still really driven by human behavior, right? And that computers are not an antidote to that. And so as long as there are, as long as people's racial biases and preferences remain, and as long as we continue to allow the private market essentially to operate without any kind of structural interventions that could be designed to fight segregation, we're going to see it being perpetuated rather than this being like the solution we hoped that it would be.
Yeah, that response actually segues, I think, really nicely into this next question that someone submitted, thinking about how we can try to kind of move the needle in some way. So how can people that are in neighborhoods who aren't landlords, aren't the people who are placing these ads, help fight against the inequalities that you've identified in your work?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. I think there's a couple of ways, right? One is there's both segregation in terms of where we actually live, and then there's segregation in terms of where do we spend our time, right? And the research shows that although people, we don't spend all of our lives only in that one neighborhood that we live in, but we do tend to spend most of our time within our own neighborhood and within other neighborhoods that are similar to our own. And that is contributing to inequality in a lot of ways, right? And so thinking about what are the spaces that you spend your day in, right? Those are things that we do have some control over as individuals, even though this is definitely a broader structural problem, which I'm sure we'll continue to talk about throughout the Q&A. What are the small businesses that you go to spend your money and your time? What are the community organizations that you're involved in? I think these are all important decisions that each of us has the power to get involved in. We can also, though, be thinking about how can we as individuals be advocating for and supporting politicians and organizations that are really trying to mobilize for like bigger structural changes, including in terms of thinking about how to keep housing affordable in neighborhoods throughout right the region, wherever it is that you live, including St. Louis. In terms of thinking about, for example, the neighborhood I live in, Shaw, which is a neighborhood in the city right by Tower Grove Park and the Botanical Garden, has over time seen a decrease in the total population because it's become popular for buildings that used to be 2 apartments or 4 apartments to be renovated into larger single family homes. And that has the impact of it, those sell for higher prices or rent for higher prices, right? So there's a market based kind of motivation for why people are doing that. But what it means is that the homes are becoming increasingly unaffordable, and there are fewer rental options for people in the rental market who tend to be have lower incomes and tend to be non-white. And so we're seeing neighborhoods like Shaw lose the non-white population over time. And I think that's happening even in neighborhoods where people really want to celebrate diversity, right? And so we have to think really hard about, right? There have been proposals, for example, to like use tax, create a tax incentive to prevent people from downsizing, right? Like homes from, a 2-family or 4-family to a single-family home, to try to incentivize people to maintain these more affordable housing options within neighborhoods throughout the city. And these are things that, right, can be tough. You might have heard the phrase NIMBY, which refers to not in my backyard. And sometimes we have to really think hard about what our own private interests are, and how do we balance them with the interest in creating inclusive communities that really can benefit everyone in our region and in our neighborhoods. And these can be, I think these can sometimes be tough decisions to navigate, but do add up to producing or to fighting inequality.
I appreciate all your thoughtful responses. I think we're going to dig into like a few of the different things that you kind of touched on in your response there. And one of the things that you said towards the end, I think kind of addresses one of the questions someone asked, and that they said, if landlords became better at advertising positive features of apartments in North City, for example, could there be a risk of rent spikes that would displace the lower income residents in that area? And if you think yes, that is the case, do you have recommendations about how you think that the advertising should be changed to avoid those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I will say, I think we probably have in St. Louis in particular, we have a long way to go before I think we would see something like that happening. But absolutely, we're not interested in displacing current residents, right? And instead, I think we want to think about how can we promote economic vitality and revitalization in neighborhoods that benefits people who live in them already, and can potentially create neighborhoods, make these neighborhoods more inclusive and welcoming spaces for folks who might move into them. When you're living in a area where the market is not competitive, landlords do not have incentives to maintain the quality of their housing, right? And there's research that shows this. And so even if you have a lease agreement, and that includes a requirement that the landlord meet, basic occupancy and housing code standards, there's not always a lot of incentive for landlords to hold up their end of the bargain, right? If they're not concerned that you as a renter have enough money to be able to leave and afford to live somewhere else. And if people are not paying attention to the quality of the housing in your neighborhood, right, there's a lack of oversight. And that can lead to people living, being taken advantage of, and living in substandard housing. And so I think, thinking about I think we need to be really careful, right, in terms of how we would think about policy interventions, for example, that would do this in ways that don't displace residents and that actually work with them. I think to work really collaboratively, right, to identify strategies to improve housing quality and bring amenities into neighborhoods, right? So things like increased, public transit options so that people can feel like they can live in a neighborhood and get to work. We have to think about, right? I mean, neighborhoods are tied into so many things, where we work. Schools, right? Making sure that the schools that our kids go to, no matter where they live, are safe and are offering a quality education and experience for students. I think these are all really complicated policy issues, but all also really intertwined when we think about housing and neighborhoods and segregation.
Yeah, thank you. And then someone actually just asked a question that I think links on what you were just talking about too, and asking about whether you had recommendations on how laws should change. So I don't know if you have anything else to add to that other than what you just kind of were mentioning.
Yeah. So, one thing that one question we've looked at is, I mentioned earlier briefly these mentions of Section 8 housing, which it refers to this housing voucher program that is a subsidy that people can get from the government to use in the private rental market to make housing more affordable. And one of the things that we've found is that landlords are marketing positively. They're trying to recruit Section 8 residents. And this is disproportionately happening in the most highly segregated, high poverty neighborhoods that have environmental hazards, that have the poorest performing schools, that we can think about a number of measures, are really disadvantaged places that have suffered from lack of investment and lack of attention. And we think that landlords are explicitly reaching out to and advertising to Section 8 households in these places because they see an opportunity to make money in a market where there is very little demand for their housing otherwise, right? So these tend to be rental units that might otherwise sit vacant, and so a landlord will be losing money on them. But Section 8 housing voucher holders often have very limited options because many landlords will not accept vouchers as part of the payment for their housing. And when you do, it's really competitive. There are many more people who are eligible for vouchers than who receive them from the government. And when you get one, you only have 30 days to prove you found housing, or you can lose your voucher, right? And so people are often put in a position where they have to very quickly find a place to rent that meets the voucher system requirements. And many people end up in really substandard housing. So we refer to these advertising practices as predatory inclusion, right? Inclusion in that it's this positive ad that is reaching out to people who often face discrimination in the rental market, but it's predatory in that it's trying to advertise housing that no one else would want to pay for if they didn't have the constraints of having a voucher. So to me, that's an example of one area that's really asking for policy intervention, right? So we could be thinking about regulating where and how housing landlords can advertise about Section 8 housing, and also thinking about how can we combat this discrimination that happens against housing voucher households, right? That landlords won't rent to them. So that's just one example where I think that we could have a real impact with policy.
Great, thank you. You mentioned schools in some of your responses so far, and that relates to another question that someone had submitted. They were specifically interested in whether you've noticed that in the rental area, people are describing things in terms of good schools. Is that something you're seeing in the ads? And if so, how would you interpret that in your research of when they're mentioning good schools?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not something we see as much in St. Louis, which I think speaks to, that we've mostly focused on St. Louis city advertisements so far when we've really done an in-depth analysis. I think speaks to the fact that the city is one school district, and people often have a pretty consistent perception of the city public school district as a whole. So it doesn't tend to differentiate neighborhoods within St. Louis as much. However, in some of the other metro areas, we've been doing this research, we do see that more often. And in fact, interestingly, we find that mentions about good schools are often associated with neighborhoods that have a larger concentration of Asian and Asian American residents. I'm particularly thinking about Los Angeles and the Bay Area here, which are two of the main metros that we've studied in California that also have larger Asian American communities. So that's where we've seen schools particularly mentioned, like particular school being within a particular school district is something that often comes up. In our experiments where we're trying to understand how do people interpret the signals that they're seeing. So this is not when someone's given any kind of explicit information about schools, but just being told, just for example, seeing mentions of evictions leads people to assume that their surrounding neighborhood has poor quality schools. And in contrast, seeing words that might imply that a neighborhood is higher income and that tends to have more white and or Asian American residents. So like I said before, I've mentions about Whole Foods, but also mentions of like what are perceived to be like high quality housing amenities, like custom countertops, hardwood floors. In some cities, right, mentions about the pool and the amenities at the apartment complex, that leads people to assume that the surrounding neighborhood has higher quality schools. So we see both. Sometimes we see mentions of schools in advertisements, and then we also see that people are inferring information about school quality from words that are not actually about the schools at all.
It's really interesting. A related question someone asked was how you've thought about different market types. And this person in particular was thinking about college towns, where most of the people that may be looking for housing are students. And in their experience, they're just giving an example about how the leases in college towns often are being asked to be renewed 4 to 6 months before the end of the lease, which can cause a lot of stress for the students. And so just curious kind of how you've thought about those kinds of issues in your research.
Yeah, so we haven't particularly studied college towns, but I will say one of the things that surprised me at first until I thought more about those particular dynamics of college towns is we were finding that words about students, student housing, being close to university campuses were coming up a lot when we were looking at ads in neighborhoods that were categorized as higher poverty. And that at first was confusing to me, right? Because I would tend to associate colleges with kind of like a higher socioeconomic status until I realized that in fact, in a lot of college towns, areas where students predominate in the housing actually are categorized as low income because students often don't have a lot of their own personal household income, right? So students who are being supported by family or scholarships or some combination of the two, including students who are working while also being in school, right, are often not making particularly high wages. And so there is an overlap between lower income neighborhoods and some of these college towns. So we do see some of those dynamics popping up in our data, but we've been primarily focused on understanding kind of these broader dynamics that we think are likely operating across cities throughout the United States. And so we haven't particularly focused on those like unique dynamics of college towns yet, but it is in the data, right? And that's part of what is really exciting about this project and why I've been working on it since 2016. And it's now, we're almost to 2023, is that there are so many questions that to be asked and that remain to be explored. And so it's been really exciting to, I've always enjoyed collaborative work, but this project in particular has led me to collaborate with, folks across different social science disciplines and across institutions on various papers, as someone has come to me and said like, oh, I think I could use your data to understand this question about college towns, or this question about rental prices during the pandemic, things that I hadn't originally had in mind at all when we started this project. And it's been really, I've gotten to learn so much through those collaborations, and it's really expanded my own understanding of our social world, which has been really cool.
Thank you. There's a few questions people have brought up regarding income versus race, right? And if you can kind of tease apart those things at all in your work, and in particular, in kind of thinking about the role of income, right? This person is kind of bringing up the idea that often cheaper rentals focus on what the renters need rather than these other additional amenities, right? And so curious kind of how you think that plays a role. And then there's another part to their question that I'll save to ask after, to just kind of let you start with that part.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as the questioner, as many of you are undoubtedly aware, in the United States, race and income are deeply tied together, right? And so we do need to be really carefully attuned to those dynamics. Part of what we do is we don't just think separately about, say, the racial demographics of the neighborhood, and then the income or poverty status or education status of the neighborhood. We think about them together. And so, for example, we'll often categorize a neighborhood as white and poor, or white and non-poor, right? Black and poor, black and non-poor. And that's one way that we can try to start teasing apart, like how much of these dynamics we're picking up are really being driven by income, regardless of race, and which are really what I would call really like more intersectional, right? That we can't understand without paying attention to both race, ethnicity, and to income and other economic dynamics. And mostly what we found is that even if we are controlling for holding constant income or poverty status, we still see these differences along racial lines. And so, an upper middle class, predominantly Black neighborhood, we still see more discussion about tenant qualifications and disqualifications that I showed you in that low income Black neighborhood ad at the beginning of the slides. And so these, there are differences in terms of what advertisements look like in poor Black communities and in wealthier Black communities, but across the board, even when we control for income or we hold income constant, we also see that race really is shaping the kind of information that people have access to, and that we can't reduce it to income, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I guess that kind of links with this. I won't guess what I'll let you answer this question yourself, but based on what you just said, one of the people that are here during the talk is asking about whether you have any data or know about any data regarding how people move, once their income increases.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have data on that in particular. So we haven't yet, what we have not done yet is like try to track individual movers as they go. There are other studies that do that. It might not surprise you. It's complicated. The more people move, the harder it is for researchers to keep track of them and get them to keep taking surveys or to get back to us. And so this is a challenging, actually a challenging question for us to navigate. Certainly, I think broadly research would say, right, that as people's incomes go up, sometimes we see them leave the rental market and move into the market for home ownership. So that is one dynamic that is not outside of what we've been studying, at least so far, but that would play a role. Um, uh, you know, I mentioned it earlier briefly. I think we in our study we tend to pay more attention to like what might happen when people's income goes down as opposed to going up, right? And thinking especially in the context of early in the pandemic, right? We saw like rapid changes in the rental market. Um, particularly in cities like New York, for example, right, where New York, the Bay Area, places where rent remains extremely high, but was even higher. And all of a sudden, people were working from home. They did not need to necessarily be within a short commute of their office anymore, and suddenly they had a lot more options in terms of where they could live, and that led to those who had the means, right, which those who had who had the privilege of working from home and had the privilege of having somewhere else to go to, often leaving, and led to high vacancy rates and real declines in rental prices. I think a lot of those markets have since, for the most part, recovered, but we have been trying to pay attention to those dynamics and to think more about the implications, the longer term implications for inequality there.
I'm glad that you actually answered one of the questions that I had, that I was having if we got through the other questions that you get to, which was about how things may have shifted during the pandemic. So that's great. Kind of digging into the details, I guess, a little bit more of things. Someone was asking if you could give an example of advertising language for North City apartments that might be more equitable and in line with what you're seeing in these Central West End ads.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just providing information, descriptive information about the housing itself, right? So describing, are the floors carpeted? Are they wood floors? Are they laminate? Um, describing the appliances that are inside the home, right? So is there a dishwasher? Is there a washer and dryer? A lot of times this information isn't there, right? It's not even that it's being described as non-functional dishwasher. It just has no information at all, because the ad is really focused on like whether you can even rent it at all based on your qualifications, and those things matter, right? And everyone I think deserves to have access to basic information about the quality, the characteristics of the housing that they're looking at, because we all have I think somewhat idiosyncratic preferences, right? Some people really want their bedroom to have carpet and other people really don't. And that doesn't necessarily imply higher or lower quality or higher or lower price. But it's about people being able to match their particular interests to the housing that's available to them within what they can afford and within the neighborhood that they're interested in. And I think in an equitable world, everyone would have access to information about whether a particular housing unit does or does not match their preferences, and that shouldn't be determined by your income or by the racial composition of the neighborhood that you're searching in.
Yeah, that feels like such just like a basic thing that people could be doing. And so do you know of any places that people are submitting advertisements where this is something that's kind of part of like a template that they may fill out? Or do you think that this is a feasible or realistic thing to work towards?
Yeah, I think it's definitely feasible from a technology perspective, right? It would not be difficult for housing websites to have by design required categories. Even Craigslist, which we think of as kind of like the most like bare bones, kind of minimalist approach, right? It's less flashy and less less designed than like Zillow, for example. It does require like very limited amount of information, which is you provide a zip code. I think it requires you to provide a price. And it requires you to provide a title, but that's about it. So there actually isn't, there are check boxes that you can choose. If you go to post, you can choose to check boxes about your pet policy, about the washer and dryer, whether they're, in the unit or in the building or not available. There's options to check boxes about, say, parking and things like that. But none of that's required for a listing to go live. And so that really minimalist approach means that there is more discretion in terms of what landlords do and don't share. And I think, part of this, again, I'm not an economist, but when I try to put on my kind of like market-based hat and toward thinking about these things, right? Sometimes it's saying like, okay, I don't want to put any more time into advertising than I have to in order to get someone, to rent my unit, right? Because as soon as I'm not making money when my unit is vacant. And so I think sometimes we see, right, some of this is about, at least the perception of how much effort do I need to put in order to get someone to rent my unit? Am I going to need to be responsive to people's interests and demands, or am I potentially going to be able to exploit a tenant who doesn't have a lot of leverage or power in the market to live somewhere else and to demand that I maintain an adequate quality of housing, right? And so I think these are really complicated dynamics, but I think that those are all playing into what information people are choosing to share or not. And we could certainly think about websites that require, right, more boxes of information to be shared before an ad can go live, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that would be fantastic because some of this, the time, right, kind of being at a premium totally makes sense that this is what is maybe part of what's motivating some of these things. But if it was just something where there's just a checkbox where all you need to do is just check those, that you could kind of get through in a couple minutes, that would be great. I think this segues nicely into another question that was submitted that's asking, what do you think might be motivating the landlords to be underselling their properties in Black neighborhoods, aside from these issues that you kind of just mentioned about the kind of practical aspect of time?
Yeah, so I do think that this is often about who do you think is going to rent your unit, and what do you think is required to get them, right? And so if your perception of who's going to rent your unit is a higher income or more highly educated renter, who's going to be more discerning and be potentially more demanding and also more aware of their rights as a tenant, and going to pay more, right? You might put more effort, you're likely to put more effort into describing the housing and to be attuned to what are the things that those renters tend to like, right? So whether that's about the amenities of the neighborhood, the amenities and the characteristics of the housing, things like that. If in contrast you perceive that who's going to rent your unit is someone who doesn't have a lot of other options, right? So maybe someone who does have a past history of an eviction or has some kind of past criminal conviction on their background, someone who has a low credit score. These are all characteristics that are used to disqualify people who would otherwise say like have the meet the income requirement, for example, be able to pay their rent on time every month, but having any of these even in your distant past can be used to disqualify you from renting. And so if you're willing as a landlord to take on some of those renters, it's likely because you know that they don't have very many options, and you can potentially exploit them. Now, I want to be clear. I think that there are a lot of different motivations for landlords, and being willing to take a chance on someone who has some of these experiences in their past can also come from a positive place, right? So we're mostly thinking about this as potential exploitation, but that's not always the case, right? There are also landlords who I think recognize that people indeed deserve multiple chances, and that these past experiences don't necessarily predict any kind of future behavior or whether someone will be a good, responsible tenant. And so I don't want to suggest that all landlords are participating in this in a biased or exploitative way, but I do think that sometimes they are, and that we need to be really carefully attuned to that.
Another related question was asking about how you think that the media representations of poor Latino, Black neighborhoods, especially in St. Louis, may be contributing to some of these trends that you're seeing in the advertisements.
Yeah, I think that paying attention to media is really important, right? So I mentioned earlier that there's all this research showing that most of us don't know very much about most of the neighborhoods in the city that we live in, and that includes St. Louis. Um, and what we do know, right, is if we don't have any kind of firsthand experience of a neighborhood or an entire part of the city potentially, we like there's a lot of research that shows that as humans we fill in the blanks, and one of the places we often look to do that is the media, whether that's local TV news, right, or other forms of media that are painting perceptions of neighborhoods. I guess I particularly think of, local TV and print news that often really is focusing on crime reports, right? And that sometimes the only footage you might see of a certain neighborhood is when the media is reporting on a crime that's occurred, and that is inherently, that there's research to show that does then shape people's perceptions and assumptions about a place, even if it's not representative at all of the neighborhood more broadly.
Mute. I'm wondering if you can kind of speak a little bit to you were mentioning multiple times in your talk about this idea of kind of racial blind spots that we may have. And I'm wondering if you could kind of speak a little bit to things that you think that we might be able to do to kind of fight against some of those racial blind spots, and maybe linking up with what you were talking about earlier of trying to like go out into areas of our community that we might not normally go to, or businesses, right? What are ways that you would kind of suggest to people to help with those blind spots?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. I think goes hand in hand in terms of thinking about what are the neighborhoods and areas that we might not know about, and also who are the people that we might not be spending very much time with, right? Because I don't think we can reduce like one causes the other. These are really kind of like back and forth processes. And so thinking about both our own kind of social networks and then the spaces that we spend time in, right? Because the spaces we spend time in are going to shape the people that we have an opportunity to meet and to build connections with. And I think that's incredibly important when we think about trying to combat some of the inequality and segregation in our region. And at the same time, knowing someone who lives in a neighborhood very different from your own can be a draw that pulls you into that neighborhood in the first place, right? They suggest, hey, like come check out this great brunch spot near me, right? That it's in a place you may not have heard of before. And so I think that it's really this like back and forth process. And so we can think about, I wouldn't prioritize one approach over the other, but I actually think about thinking about both simultaneously. I think that there are, I'm not thinking of the names off the top of my head, but there are organizations in St. Louis, for example, that specifically promote Black-owned small businesses. I know I've seen those like on social media, for example. I think that can be a great way to get a sense of some of the other opportunities and amenities that are out there in our city that people might not already be aware of. And then going and spending time in places and getting to know people and building those connections, I think are really essential, because that's what keeps us going back, right? Going back to a place and really getting to know it better is not just going one time to a business. I think that's a good step. But also thinking about who do we spend our time with, not just where do we spend our time, and that really trying to focus on both of those.
Yeah, I love that. That really resonates with me as someone who in my research, relationships are central, also, and we're running a little short on time. So maybe this is the last question. Just thinking about your research more broadly, someone had asked, why it is that you think it's important to be including both qualitative and quantitative. And maybe you can just give an example, right, of kind of each of those types of methods, like how you've used them and how they've kind of provided unique and important perspectives on your work.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what I love about sociology in particular, because I think as a discipline, we really value these, diverse methodological approaches. I think that quantitative approaches, so for example, like, collecting all these millions of advertisements allows us to identify patterns that might be hard to nail down without a lot of data, right? And so we're able to say, like, actually, this is happening. This isn't just that we picked two advertisements that look really different in order to prove a point. Like, we can show you that this happens over and over again in cities across the United States. And I think that can be a really powerful message and is an important dimension of research. But there are so many unanswered questions when we're just looking at those big picture patterns, right? And so when it comes to thinking about what are the unique interactions and dynamics that are happening, say, between tenants and landlords, right? These are complicated relationships and negotiations. And I think it can be, as I was even catching myself before, I think it can be easy to use those kind of quantitative patterns to potentially make assumptions about people's motivations and biases that don't always play out, right? And that we are going to miss those really important nuances if we don't engage in smaller scale, more qualitative research that allows us to get on the ground and to talk to people. Another quick thing I'll just mention is that I think it's really important to emphasize that a lot of these patterns are happening in cities across the United States, but also that the distinct ways they play out really are different in different cities, right? And so the geography and the history of segregation in St. Louis makes it a unique place for us to be thinking about these questions, for example, right? And just looking at the really big picture, broad patterns, we would miss so much about what's going on in a place like St. Louis. Right? St. Louis is not the same as Los Angeles, right? And I think it's important for us to be doing research that both is trying to think about what are the big picture patterns, but also what are the unique dynamics in different places that might require, different policy interventions and different policy solutions.
Thank you so much for sharing this important work. I feel so grateful to have been asked to moderate this session and had the opportunity to hear you come to my department and talk about this work and then talk about it now, like in this setting, has just been fantastic. And thank you to everyone for joining us for today. Special thanks, of course, to you for sharing your work with us. And just as kind of a housekeeping note, this is the final Power of Arts and Sciences event for the semester. If you missed any of the earlier talks, you can find the recordings on the Arts and Sciences website, and a link to the Power of Arts and Sciences page is going to be posted in the chat, just right now for you. So you can stay tuned for more events that'll be happening in the spring. And so on behalf of Arts and Sciences at WashU, thank you all again for this fantastic discussion and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.